We will now be joined in a presentation, the first of our afternoon presentations, by Sam Jenkins, Collections Manager at People's History Museum. And Sam is going to discuss how cataloguing practices at the museum have adapted to community needs. So again, please pop your questions for Sam and for Nico, our afternoon speakers, in the Q&A as well. Thanks, and thanks, Sam.
Thank you, and thanks to all the previous speakers and panelists. You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure everyone agrees. So I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing at People's History Museum to try and balance the needs of our collections management with the needs of the communities we work with and serve, especially in relation to an audit we recently undertook related to disabled people's rights and activism. The work we've done fits into a few wider contexts. First, our collection and model of co-creation. People's History Museum is an independent museum in Manchester. We tell the story of the fight for people's rights, equality and justice, covering trade union history, early radicals, right up to modern campaigns like the fight for LGBTQ+ rights and the Black Lives Matter campaigns. The key focus of a lot of our work is co-creation, helping our communities to tell their own stories. We've been doing this since 2017 with our programme Never Going Underground, which focused on LGBTQ+ rights. And with each programme, we've developed more depth to what it means for us to co-create. Since 2017, we've looked at women's rights, protest, and people's experience of migration, which brings us up to our current co-created programme, Nothing About Us Without Us, which is looking at disabled people's rights and activism. The second important context for us is, of course, our backlogs. Whilst working through the pandemic, I finally had the chance to really delve into what our backlogs were, get to know our unknowns. And we now separate our backlog into several distinct parts to keep me sane mostly. We've got the modern backlog, which is objects acquired since 2016. We've got the COVID backlog, which is objects acquired during COVID. And the historic backlogs, so objects acquired before 2016, which tend to be in our storage, are either uncatalogued or very poorly catalogued. I've got a couple of photos here of some of our historic backlog areas in our store where you can see things are just in boxes, and I don't know what's in those boxes. I've been able to really highlight to colleagues through this work that we've got a lot more than we know about, that there's a lot of potential in our collection going unutilised, and importantly, our community co-creators cannot use these things if we don't know we have them. It's also essential to understand the requirements for finding things in the backlogs, unless you happen to be the one who's taken these objects in and you've put it in that box or on that shelf. The knowledge probably isn't there for you to know for definite where to look, which means that to find thematic objects for communities in your backlog takes a lot of resources, especially time. And the final context for us is around our approach to decolonisation and the democratisation of our collections. I've spent the last few years grappling with understanding decolonisation and what that means for People's History Museum in particular. We've realised that decolonisation is about removing the colonial constructs of power and redressing the balance of colonial systems. And importantly, that these power systems intersect and created the inequality and discrimination that many of our communities see today, and many of those communities that we've worked with over the past 5 years. To sum up my years of consideration, white colonialism relied on a narrative of supremacy, and this has played out through discrimination today. We realised through looking at our database and considering what we know we have compared to what we can find through our searches, that this has played out for us in the minimisation of people's histories, the inequality of information held and shared. The best records in our database are linked to trade unions or key white political figures, and context was sorely lacking for anything other than those heroes of history. So this is really where our approach to decolonisation coincided with our approach to co-creation. When co-creating, we are empowering our communities to tell their own stories. And in our database, we need to collect those stories and let them shine. In working with communities directly, we aren't only decolonising the database, but we're democratising it as well. So we have three aims in auditing and cataloguing that which are being carried forward through all of our cataloguing work, whether that's new acquisitions, ongoing projects, or programme-specific audits. The first is change the focus. Able-bodied, cis, hetero, white British history isn't the default, and we need to stop cataloguing as if it is. We need to pay more attention to context. Descriptions of what an object looked like help collections managers find things, but they don't help us to understand the history, use the objects, or allow people to piece together the bits of their past. And finally, to make sure things are visible. We're now using keywording to provide one easily searchable place for as many contextual cues as possible. So how have we used this in practice? Well, firstly, we had to figure out what we were looking for and where to look. We used the database, searching particular words and phrases to find out what we definitely had and where those objects were. Next, I listed areas where it would be likely for us to find something that wasn't keyworded or possibly catalogued at all, those places in the store that might have a few secrets to tell. One of our programme officers, Zosha Kufeld, then undertook the audit of the collection based on this information. She found the objects, looked in the likely places, and undertook research to see if they were really relevant to the programme that we were putting on. She added the key information that we needed for collections management, the location, conditions, record shots. And then we moved on to the context and the community. We invited our community curators to our off-site store to look at some of the objects that we found. Through discussions with them, they were really able to add a level of depth that we wouldn't have been able to do ourselves. Being involved in activism for their community, they were able to really bring the objects to life. They knew about connections between objects that we would never have been able to make, and they were able to share with us what they were able to share with us has really improved what we know. I have to give a few examples here because there's really no other way of sharing how exciting all of this was. So on this slide, we've got a few of the objects that we found, some of them catalogued and some of them not. Here we've got an example of a registration card under the Disabled Persons Employment Act 1946. The act was created to encourage the employment of disabled people, especially ex-servicemen and women, and so introduced quotas for employers, which you can see in the red pamphlet. This continued for a long time, becoming the Disabled Persons Register, because only if you were registered as a disabled person under the Act would your work count towards the quota that employers had to meet. People would be asked about having their cards if they were trying to access services, and were questioned about being a card-carrying disabled person because of this act, because of the act of having a register card, when actually there were a lot of people who weren't registered because they weren't able to work. And there were people who wanted to work but were considered too disabled to work, so they weren't registered and then were unable to find work, even though their disabilities weren't actually that disruptive. For instance, people who were deaf or blind whose access needs could probably be accommodated with a little bit of effort. Likewise, we learned about the various mobility campaigns and how they were not only connected, but sometimes they butt up against each other, where one group would be campaigning for better accommodation on public transport, another would be campaigning for accessible cars and individual mobility. It really showed that the campaigns weren't all working towards the same aims, and they didn't always agree. That's also evident in the language, where there's still disagreement in the community about the use of disabled people or people with disabilities being the better term. So all of this information was taken down by Zosha and added into the records for our collection. We were able to add so much of that context, which is visibly online for people searching at home and available for future research for staff or researchers to use. We've also been able to add keywords to make sure that people can find these objects with ease. And importantly, for the title of this presentation, The records are balanced between my needs as a collections manager and the needs of the community. I've got very little time for in-depth research into every object in the collection. I need to know what something is and where it is, but the people using these objects need to know more. And so by opening up the cataloguing process, we're able to allow them to develop the information and access the information at a later date, while I can focus on being able to find stuff. But the balance wasn't always easy. Every museum at some point has to grapple with language, and I know we've discussed language earlier today, and ours was no exception. In my initial approach to our audit, I was very aware about the possibility of discriminatory or outdated language in the database, and I was very surprised to find very little of it when searching. I imagine it's because our database is relatively new. In fact, our collections are fairly new, only having been accessioned from 1989. So we don't have centuries of language copied from catalogue cards to contend with. But there are still objects where phrases are used that we wouldn't use now, which are integral to their interpretation, such as this fabric flower from John Groom's Cripplage and Flower Girl's Mission, and this leaflet about a talk titled The Silent Handicap. This is where the balance became really necessary. It's important for collections contexts that we keep the connection to John Groom's mission and keep the fact that it was called a cripplage, but the phrase has the potential to be very offensive. Likewise, the title of the talk on this pamphlet includes language that we would not use today. In balancing this need, we knew that we needed to keep these words in certain areas of the database, but it didn't need to be in the keyword section. And in the description, which pulls through to our collections online database, we need to contextualize it and really be really open and transparent that these words are here for historical context and the management of the collection. There were, of course, other issues as well. We found that accessibility of the database was a huge problem that could not be resolved. Our database font size is set to a particular level and can't be enlarged, making it impossible for one of our curators, Anis, to use because they have a significant visual impairment. Likewise, you can't change the text box colors through formatting, and the field names, help screen, and even the module lists aren't formattable. This influenced the way we had to work because the curators couldn't edit information directly into the database. So instead of giving direct access, Zosha instead had to record the information shared by the curators. This had the benefit that a lot more information was given because of the conversational element, but also required a significant amount of staff time. On the days where the curators were in the stores, Zosha couldn't do any other work. Her focus had to be on recording information. Another huge issue we had came in from the off, which is time and resources. As an independent museum, we don't have a lot of resource, including staff. The core collection team is me, and we've got one additional full-time equivalent working on a project basis. The reason that this is such a big issue is that I wasn't actually asked about doing this audit. I was informed it had been put in a funding bid by another team who didn't know how much work they were signing me up for. Now, I'm really glad that we've been able to do the work, but it did involve a lot of planning and preparation and the extension of the work outside of the collections team to enable it to happen. Without Zosha, none of this would have been able to take place. The timing of the audit also caused a few problems, as well as clashing with other major projects. The audit was taking place at the same time as exhibition planning, so there were limited opportunities for objects to be used in the upcoming exhibition, which led us to the final problem, which was the death of motivation. Finding, recontextualizing and cataloging objects is a lot of work, especially when you add in the emotional labor of listening and discovering people's experiences of discrimination and fighting that discrimination. To then know that it's unlikely there'll be a visible output makes it very difficult to keep on going. Coupling this with the wider issues facing people in the sector at the moment, burnout, fear of the cost of living, continued stress from COVID, it was near impossible to keep the project going. Managing these issues relied on really strong planning, acknowledging the weaknesses and adapting to needs. We couldn't use the simple system of having curators interpret directly into the database, so we had to have a staff member as a conduit for those changes. We didn't have the capacity in the collections team to undertake all of the work, so we called in help from the department leading the co-creation. And we struggled to keep motivation for the audit up. And honestly, the only way to deal with that was to take a break. Instead of looking for particular objects, Zosha and I would have a route around in a random box. This helped us get to know the wider collection better, and sometimes we found things that related to the project, but it also helped us get that motivation for finding objects back. And we found some really cool stuff that wasn't related to the project, which I've shared some photographs here, and it's great to know about. I think my favourite is either the little plant drawings by Cliff Rowe, or the wonderful photo of, I believe it's George Bernard Shaw. And the final lesson that I've learned is to make sure that all of this information is fed back to other teams. It turns out that people can and will put in work for you in their funding bids, thinking that they're helping, when actually it just causes a crisis. Feeding back from these projects, I'll let them know that the timing was terrible, we didn't manage as much as we could have done with more of a lead time, and if they want to do this sort of thing again, it needs to come with a dedicated resource because of the amount of work that this type of slow cataloguing actually takes. Thank you. Altogether, we were able to fit some backlog resolution into an exhibition programme through strong planning, balancing the needs of the collections team and the wider community, which means both departments needed to work together with the community curators to find success. And I have to give a shout out here to the people who actually did the work, Zosha Kefelt, and our community curators, Anis Akhtar, Alison Wild, Hannah Ross and Ruth Malkin. Unfortunately, they're all too busy with the actual exhibition that is opening soon, so I'm giving the talk. Thank you.